One assassination triggered a global firestorm. In just days, the world plunged into a war like no other: machine guns, gas attacks, and trenches soaked in blood. This is the real, raw story of World War I, the battles, the betrayals, and the moment humanity broke itself apart. From the deserts of Arabia to the frozen fields of France, this war didn't just change borders, it changed history forever. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind the war that created our modern world, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with history lovers everywhere. The Great War begins now, in the summer of 1914. Europe stood like a powder keg, tense, overarmed, and waiting for a spark. That spark came on June 28th in Sarajevo, a city under Austro-Hungarian control, where a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired two shots that would change the world. His bullets struck Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie, killing them both. What seemed like a local act of terrorism quickly unraveled into a global catastrophe. The First World War but how could the death of one man ignite a war that would engulf the entire planet? The answer lies in a deadly web of alliances, unchecked nationalism, imperial greed, and the thirst for military dominance. For decades, Europe's great powers had been locking horns, quietly building armies, forming secret pacts, and racing to expand their empires. Britain ruled the seas, France looked to reclaim lost glory, Russia wanted to dominate the Balkans, Austria-Hungary clung to fading influence, and Germany, young, powerful, and ambitious, was hungry to prove itself. When Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination, it issued an impossible ultimatum. Serbia refused to fully comply, and within days Austria-Hungary declared war. That single decision pulled one nation after another into the conflict. Russia, bound to protect Serbia, mobilized its massive army. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, tied to Russia, joined next. And when Germany invaded neutral Belgium to reach France, Britain entered the war to protect Belgian neutrality. In less than a week, the world collapsed into chaos. Millions cheered as soldiers marched off to war, thinking it would all be over by Christmas. But they didn't understand the scale of what was coming. This wasn't a war of swift charges and glorious victories. It was a war born in the age of machine guns, barbed wire, and industrial slaughter. As Europe hurtled toward destruction, trains carried armies across borders. Propaganda whipped up patriotic fury, and governments promised a noble fight for honor and justice. Behind closed doors, generals clung to outdated strategies, politicians made bold declarations. None of them foresaw that this war would last 4 brutal years and claim over 16 million lives. The balance of power had shattered. The old world order had cracked. The globe was now locked in what would be called the War to End All Wars, a title that would later echo in bitter irony. From Berlin to Paris, from London to Moscow, from the Balkans to the Middle East. This was no longer a European affair. It was a global struggle. Colonies from Africa, soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, and beyond were drawn into a fight they never started. The assassination was only the beginning. What followed was the collapse of diplomacy, the rise of total war, and the beginning of the bloodiest conflict humanity had ever seen. This was the moment when the modern world was born in fire. The gunfire in Sarajevo didn't just kill a royal couple, it shattered the illusion of peace. In its place came trenches, gas, tanks, and terror. And though no one knew it yet, World War I was only the first act in a century of global conflict. Stay with us, because what comes next is darker than anyone could imagine. The trenches of the Western Front await. When the war began, leaders on all sides promised a swift victory. They spoke of glory, patriotism, and honor. But by the end of 1914, those dreams were buried in mud. The Western Front had frozen into a brutal stalemate. 400 miles of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. What followed was not war as the world had known it, but something far worse. A nightmare of endless suffering, bloodshed, and despair. Men lived and died in the mud. Trenches were narrow, cold, and infested with rats the size of cats, lice chewed into soldiers' skin. Waterlogged boots caused a condition called trench foot, where flesh would rot and fall away. The smell of death was constant, bodies buried. In the walls, gas lingering in the air, and decay seeping into every breath. This wasn't war. This was hell. Soldiers slept in shifts, constantly alert for the shriek of an incoming shell or a surprise night raid. And when orders came to go over the top, it meant leaving the safety of the trench and running across a killing field of barbed wire, mud, and machine gun fire. Thousands died in seconds. No ground was gained. Every yard of earth cost hundreds of lives. The technology of killing had evolved. The machine gun, once a rare battlefield novelty, now mowed down entire battalions in minutes. Artillery became the true king of battle, with shells the size of small cars tearing men apart. But it was poison gas that changed everything. First chlorine, then phosgene, and later mustard gas, each one more horrifying than the last. Gas blinded, burned, and suffocated. Even gas masks couldn't always save you. In 1916, the Battle of Verdun began, a 10-month bloodbath where French and German armies clashed in the longest battle of the war. Over 700,000 casualties for a few miles of land. That same year, the British launched the Battle of the Somme. On the first day alone, they lost nearly 60,000 men, many in the first hour. These weren't victories. They were slaughters. The war became a machine that devoured men. Young boys, barely 18, sent into the fire, letters from home soaked with tears. Mothers waited for sons who would never return. The sounds of screams, of shells, of silence after an explosion became the soundtrack of a lost generation. The trenches didn't just scar the land, they shattered minds. Thousands suffered from what we now call PTSD, then called shell shock. Men who once laughed and sang returned home unable to speak, haunted by what they'd seen. And yet, amidst the horror, life went on. Soldiers shared food, told stories, carved graffiti into trench walls. In rare moments of peace, they played cards, sang songs, and tried to forget the horror that surrounded them. There was even a Christmas truce in 1914 where enemies laid down their guns, met in no man's land, and played football, but it didn't last. The war machine wouldn't allow it. Back home, civilians were told to keep calm and carry on. Propaganda painted the war as noble and just. Women filled the factories, making bullets, tanks, and uniforms. Children collected scrap metal for the cause. Governments demanded total commitment. This was no longer just a fight between soldiers, it was total war. World War I turned the fields of Europe into graveyards. It introduced weapons and tactics that turned humanity against itself. The trenches became a symbol of human endurance and human madness. And as the bodies piled higher, the war showed no sign of ending. But while the Western Front bled, other fronts were opening. The Middle East would soon erupt. Revolution would shake Russia. And a distant power, watching carefully across the Atlantic, was preparing to enter the fray. The war was about to become truly global, and nothing would ever be the same again. By 1917, the First World War had reached far beyond the mud-soaked trenches of Europe. What began as a European conflict had now consumed the world. Every corner of the globe was pulled into the inferno. The sun never set on this war. It stretched from the icy Baltic to the deserts of Arabia, from the African colonies to the Pacific Ocean. World War I was no longer a continental struggle. It was a total global war. The Ottoman Empire, once known as the sick man of Europe, had joined the Central Powers, throwing the Middle East into chaos. Their entrance opened new fronts, harsh, brutal campaigns across deserts and mountains. In the sands of Arabia, a young British officer named T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, would lead Arab rebels in a fierce guerrilla war against Turkish forces. Bridges were blown, trains derailed, cities burned. It wasn't just armies fighting anymore. It was tribes, resistance fighters, civilians all tangled in the same storm. Meanwhile, Colonial soldiers from across the British and French empires were dragged into battles they barely understood. Indian troops died in European winters. African regiments fought in places they'd never heard of. From Australia to Canada, from Senegal to Vietnam, men who had never seen Europe now bled for it. Over 4 million non-European troops served in the war. They weren't just extras in someone else's story, they were heroes, casualties and forgotten victims of imperial ambition. But as the war raged across continents, something seismic was about to rupture the Eastern Front. In 1917, after years of brutal fighting and growing unrest at home, the Russian Empire collapsed. Bread riots in the streets of Petrograd turned into a full-scale revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty rulers of Russia for over 300 years was overthrown. In their place rose Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Promising peace, land, and power to the people, Lenin had a singular goal: pull Russia out of the war. He signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in early 1918, surrendering huge swaths of Russian territory. It was a stunning blow, too. The Allies now, the Eastern Front was gone, and Germany could pour its forces westward. For a moment, it seemed like the Central Powers might actually win. But across the Atlantic, the tide was turning. The United States, once committed to neutrality, could no longer stay out. German submarines had been attacking civilian ships, most infamously the RMS Lusitania in 1915, which killed 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. But it was the secret Zimmermann telegram that pushed America over the edge of German proposal to Mexico, offering U.S. territory in return for joining the war. When the message was intercepted and exposed, public outrage erupted. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson called it a fight to make the world safe for democracy. The arrival of American troops, fresh and full of energy, would shift the balance. They brought not just soldiers, but steel, oil, and optimism. By mid-1918, over 1 million Americans had landed in France. This was the turning point. The war had drained Europe. The old empires were bleeding men and money. Germany was under blockade. Austro-Hungary was cracking from within. And now, with the U.S. in the fight, the Allies had the momentum. World War was no longer just about borders or alliances. It was a fight for the future of the world. Monarchies were collapsing. New ideologies were rising. Millions were dying. For ideas, for freedom, for power. The battlefield stretched across oceans and continents. And the question was no longer who would win, but how much the world would lose before it ended. What followed was the final year of agony, one last push, one last storm. The end was coming. But peace would not be what anyone hoped for. By 1918, the world was exhausted. 4 years of war had left millions dead, cities shattered, and nations on the edge of collapse. But Germany, desperate to win before American reinforcements arrived in full force, launched one final massive offensive on the Western Front. For months, artillery thundered, men charged, and ground was 1 inch by inch. The Kaiser's forces surged toward Paris, one last gamble to break the stalemate. And for a moment it almost worked. But the Allies had learned. American troops poured in, their energy and numbers tipping the scale. The German army stretched too far and starved. By a naval blockade began to crumble. Back home, German civilians were rioting, starving, and calling for change. The empire that had marched so proudly to war was now unraveling from within. In November 1918, Germany's allies began to fall. Bulgaria surrendered. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Austria-Hungary, already fractured by internal divisions, disintegrated into chaos. And finally, on November 9th, the German Kaiser abdicated and fled to exile. 2 days later, in a quiet train carriage in a forest near Compiègne, France, German officials signed the armistice. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. But silence didn't mean peace. Asterisk the world looked nothing like it did in 1914. Empires had collapsed. Monarchies were gone, borders had been shattered. Over 16 million people were dead, another 21 million were wounded. Entire cities were graveyards, generations of young men were lost. And the survivors? They were forever changed, broken, disillusioned, and searching for meaning in the ruins of civilization. The war to end all wars had ended, but the way it ended planted the seeds for something far worse. Asterisk in 1919, the victorious Allies gathered in Versailles to decide the fate of the defeated. But what emerged was not justice, it was punishment. The Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany accept full blame for the war. It was stripped of land, its colonies seized, its military dismantled, and it was forced to pay impossible reparations. Humiliated and economically strangled, Germany simmered with anger and resentment. Asterisk new nations were carved out of old empires: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Syria, and more drawn on maps by men who had never set foot on the ground. Ethnic tensions, political instability, and broken promises festered in these newly born states. What was intended to bring peace only guaranteed future conflict. Asterisk meanwhile, the League of Nations was formed, a global body meant to prevent another catastrophe. But without the support of the United States, who had returned to isolationism, it was powerless. The global economy limped forward, and the trauma of war infected art, literature, politics, and culture. Asterisk World War I didn't end. A chapter, it began a darker one. Fascism rose from the ashes in Italy. Communism took hold in Russia. And in Germany, a broken soldier named Adolf Hitler was already building his vision of revenge. The Great War had redrawn the world, but not in ink. It was redrawn in blood. Asterisk if this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of history, then help us share it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from the past, and share it with someone who needs to know how our world was shaped. Because history is not just what happened, it's what warns us of what could happen again. Asterisk.